Right now, we are manually handling the loading state and we're not even handling errors. Wouldn't it be nice if we could let the hook handle the loading and error states for us? Well, that's what we're going to do. The best way to do this is to assign a status or a state to the data depending on what's happening. So, if it's loading, we can set the state to loading, and if it's errored, then we can set the state to error. We can manage these states with something like a switch statement or a JavaScript object, which will allow us to manage the states of data and return the correct state to the client. Cool. Let's go into the code and start to implement this. Let's first create a function below our prefetch on event function called formatDataResponse. Let's press enter a few times after line 26 to give it some space, and then on line 28 we're going to write function formatDataResponse. We'll add parentheses and then curly braces. This is going to create the object that will contain the loading and error states. So what we're going to do is give each value in our data cache an object with a status value. This means each item will be an object that contains a status value and data, which we'll call payload. Because of that, we can destructure the status and payload values as arguments in our formatDataResponse function. Then we can create an object, which we're going to make a const called status response, and this is going to return the correct object based on the status. It may sound a bit confusing now, but once I write the code, it will make much more sense. So if we have a status of loading, then we want to return an object that's going to make is loading true. Let's add another property. So after line 30, we'll hit enter and add a new property of error. This is going to have a value of error, and this will return the error as a payload. And finally, we're going to have one more. We'll actually duplicate the last line to do that. And let's change error over here on line 32 to success. And then we can change the error here as well to data. Cool. And beneath that, so after our status response object, we can return the status response that matches the status that is passed in as an argument. Cool. Now, because we want to be able to destructure the object for our useData hook, we'll need to pass default values to other properties. For example, the loading status here on line 30 will also need to have a value for error and data, and these can both be null, but they have to have a value. So we can do this by creating a new variable, which we're going to call default data. And this is going to equal an object with all the default values. So is loading will be false, error will be null, and data will also be null. Nice. Now on line 31, 32, and 33, we can actually spread the default data object so that only the value that we want to change will be changed. Let's copy the default data variable, and here all we have to do is write a spread operator, paste a variable, and add a comma. So what's going on this line, line 31, is that default data is spread out, and only the isLoading value here is changed from false to true. And we can do the same on line 32 as well. So here, after the error and after the opening curly brace, we can do a spread, paste, and add a comma as well. Similarly, on line 31, before the word data, we can do a spread, paste, and add a comma as well. Cool. Now that we have this, we can update our prefetch data function to add the status and payload data to the cache. So let's scroll up in this file until we get to line 18. And over here, we're going to change data to an object that will contain a status. In this case, we want this to be success. And we want to give it a payload of just data. And now that we have a status, we also have a way to handle errors in the code. So while we're here, we can add a catch block on line 20. So at the end of the parentheses, we'll write catch, add parentheses, and then inside these parentheses, we're going to add another set of parentheses with an argument of error. Then we're going to add an arrow function, add curly braces, and then hit enter. So what we want to do here when there's an error is the same as a success, but we want to return the error in the payload. So let's copy all of line 18 and line 19, and we'll paste it on line 21. Then, where it says success, we'll change to error, and where it says data, we'll also change that to error. And while we're here, we can add a console error just to tell the developer that there's been an error. So here I'm going to add some backticks and say error prefetching data for key, and then add a $sign and curly braces. And here we'll put the key in with a colon and add a comma. Then we'll paste the error message. Sweet. I've noticed I've spelled error incorrectly on line 21. So let's go ahead and change that. We'll select the text and write error. Now you can see that on line 19 and also on line 23, we've got the dispatch code twice. We can avoid this duplication by using the finally block. So I'm going to press Command X to cut this code. And at the end of line 23, I'm going to write finally, add parentheses. And inside these parentheses, I'm going to add another parentheses with an arrow function. And this is going to have curly braces. And I'm going to paste in the dispatch event. This also means we can delete the code on line 22. Nice, this is looking good. Now let's go ahead and update the code in our useData hook to make use of our format data response function. Let's quickly talk about that. So when we first call the useData hook, if there's no data inside the cache, we want to add a status of loading to the cache with an empty payload or a payload that has a value of null. This means that the loading object is returned to the user or client. Then, when the data is fetched, we want to update the status to success or error based on what's happened and add the relevant data to the payload. And this will update the correct properties in the client. Cool. Let's go back to the code. Okay, at the top of our useData hook, let's add an if statement to check if the key argument is in the cache. So at the end of line 5, I'm going to press enter, write if, add parentheses, and I'm going to add a space between the if and the opening parentheses. And inside the parentheses, I'm going to add an exclamation mark, write data cache dot has, add parentheses, and here I'm going to write key. Then, if it doesn't have the key inside the cache, what we're going to do is set the cache, so write data cache dot set, and here we'll set the key to have an object of status, which will be loading, and it will have a payload of null. Cool. We can also change the default value of useState on line 9 from null to something like data cache.get, add parentheses, and then write key. Since we're setting the payload to null on line 7, then a key should always have a value, so it makes sense to always fetch the data from the cache. Now, beneath that, we can change our if statement to only return data if the cache doesn't have a status of loading. So, on line 11, we're going to change data cache has to data cache.get, and we'll get the status and make sure it doesn't equal the string of loading, which means it will be success or error. If that's the case, then data has been added to the cache properly, and we can just return that data. But we want to return the formatted object. So let's highlight this code on line 12 and change it to format data response. And we're going to add parentheses and give it an argument of data. Now there's one last thing to do in this file, and that's on line 16. So beneath our event listener, since we don't want to return the data from the cache, we want to format it first. Let's change data to use our formatted data response function. So we're going to write format data response and add parentheses, and we'll give it an argument of data. Nice, and that should be it. Let's go ahead and make use of this object in our relevant components. We'll first go to our home component. So here on line 8, let's change the word Pokemons to an object that's destructured. So we'll delete this word and add curly braces. Then we're going to write data, and we'll change that value of data to Pokemons. And then we're going to have is loading, and we'll also have error. And now that we have our own is loading property, what we can do is replace this if statement on line 10 to make use of that instead of Pokemons. So we'll delete this code in the parentheses and paste in our is loading variable. We can even add another if statement below that to check if there's an error. So we'll write if, add parentheses, and then write error to make use of our error variable, and then add curly braces. And what we can do here is we can just return a div that will contain the error and also the error message from the catch method. Very cool. Now, if we go to the browser and do a hard refresh, so that will be Shift Command R or Shift Control R if you're on Windows, we can see very briefly that the text loading appears. This means that our loading status is working. But what about our error status? Well, let's go back to the code and update it to try and test that. Inside our API Pokemon.js file, let's update the getPokemons function by selecting and commenting out line 17 and 18. Then, at the end of line 16, hit enter, and what we're going to do is have a promise rejection. So we're going to write return promise.reject, add parentheses, and then we're going to write new error, add parentheses, and we're going to type something in here. So we can write something has gone wrong. Cool. Now, let's go back to the browser, and we can see that our error state is being handled by the hook. Nice.
If you want to keep learning about how to build real-world apps with the latest technologies and other career-related topics, then start right now by subscribing to our channel and liking this video.